Hello, we're Lilith and Lara here with Coffee, Cakes, and Castles, where we will be covering the 20,000 to 25,000 castles of Germany. We'll be talking about historical facts, myths, legends, and drama.
Today, we'll be talking about some fascinating history, including the changing of dynasties, the fight to claim the title as emperor, and witches of the Harz Mountains.
Hello, I'm Lilith from America.
And I'm Lara from Germany, and we're just two girls who happen to love all the things involving coffee, cakes, and castles, especially when you can have coffee and cake inside a castle. And today we're heading to what was once one of the most important palaces of the Holy Roman Empire. This is the Imperial Palace of Goslar. We will just jump into how to visit. And if you're interested in visiting, you can find the Imperial Palace of Goslar or Kaiserpfalz Goslar in the town of Goslar, which is north of the Harz Mountains in the Niedersachsen region of Germany, Lower Saxony. You can tour the palace, so be sure to check the website. And among the things you'll be able to see on the tour, there are the Palatinate Chapel, the Imperial Hall, the Winter Hall, and the Imperial Chair.
And this is one that we did not visit, but we did get to go hiking in the Harz Mountains. And I think we were kind of fairly close to
We
Goslar.
were, and if
Yeah.
I'd known about it, I would have jumped just in the car and got you to Goslar.
Yes, next time.
Next time. The list is getting
Okay.
longer and longer and
I
longer and
know,
longer.
I don't. We'll figure this out. We'll do it. And let's dive into the history of the Imperial Palace of Goslar. It was once one of the most important palaces of the Holy Roman Empire. It may not have been a permanent capital, but as we'll learn, kings and emperors regularly held court at Goslar, beginning with Henry II around 1009 AD, with over 13 kings and emperors staying at Goslar throughout the years. Described in the 11th century as the most famous residence of the empire, it held its peak importance from around 1000 to 1253 AD. Goslar would become central because of silver mining at the Ramelsburg from the 12th to 15th century. At this time, the city joined the Hanseatic League, and the Hanseatic League was a coalition of North German towns and merchants, and it would dominate maritime trade in the North and Baltic seas, so this was a big deal for them.
So why Goslar? To understand why Goslar became such a crucial center of imperial power, we have to look at its earliest phase. Adam of Bremen, who was a chronicler during the Ottonian period, described the site as a royal hunting lodge and a mill situated near early settlement traces at the foot of the Harz Mountains. The transformation from a simple hunting lodge into a palace was all thanks to Henry II. Around 1005, Henry II would build the first imperial mansion of Goslar, marking the beginning of formal palace constructions on the site. His growing use of Goslar is well documented, with Goslar becoming a place where charters were signed and synods and diets held, with synods and diets being meetings for matters of the church and state. And the reason for this rapid rise in importance was both for strategy and for economic reasons. As Lilas mentioned before, the Rummelsburg became central to silver mining, and by 1035, all royal activity was moved from Werla to Goslar, which was where the money was. Before we move on to Henry II, there's actually a fascinating legend of how the silver was found. It's said that in 968, a knight reached the foot of the Rammelsberg. His horse taped its hoof on the ground and they dug in the spot, discovering a high-quality deposit of silver. Just the better humans.
Discover the silver. And Henry II wasn't without drama, both political and personal. In fact, he was apparently so interesting that his marriage to Cunegunda of Luxembourg was often told in medieval storytelling. Henry and Cunegunda never had children, and there were rumors of a vow of chastity, though this is debated. This was a time period where having children was extremely important to marriage, so think having heirs to the throne. But Henry refused to repudiate his wife life, and it was said, and this is a quote, that his fidelity bore witness to his deep love for his wife and profound respect for the sanctity of marriage. And Henry and Cunegunda were both venerated as saints, and there is a legend that Cunegunda walked over burning plowshares to prove her fidelity to Henry. And if you
Okay.
look it up, yes, if you look it up, yeah, there are a lot of stories from the medieval period that you can find about Henry and Cunegunda. So it's very interesting stuff. We just don't have time for
Yeah.
all of it.
It would
Yeah.
take a lot of time.
Yes.
And we will just dive into the political drama. And Henry II's rise to power was one of the most dramatic successions in the 11th century. Very long story short, son of Henry
Yes.
the Quarrelsome, Duke of Bavaria, Henry II became king in 1002, with that sights set on the title of Holy Roman Emperor, and knowing that there was a strong opposition towards him, he took the royal insignia after the death of King Otto III. Though the majority of princes declared against him, this did not deter him, and after several successful campaigns, he marched to Rome and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Benedict the VIII.
And when we say he took the royal insignia, so that's things like the crown, the robe, everything that the Holy Roman Emperor gets. And he just came in and took it and was like, I will be emperor.
I will be the, yeah.
Yes.
Bold
And that
move,
is the short
move.
Yes. And we will see a lot of bold moves throughout this episode. We got some good drama coming up. And why talk about Henry II at all in relation to the Imperial Palace of Goslar? He may not have built the palace, but he is the reason the palace exists. He selected Goslar because of the Ramelsburg silver mine, built the first imperial mansion, and brought the synods and diets that Lara mentioned to Goslar, and witnessed the signing of charters in Goslar as well. He was the one who shifted the central policy center from Rilla to Goslar. So very important.
Yeah. And now getting into the building phase, we will, just talk a little bit about it. The Imperial Palace of Goslar began to take shape under Conrad II. Following the death of Henry II, who had no heirs, the Salian line took over with Conrad II as king. And Conrad II would lay the foundations for the stone church of Our Lady in Goslar in the 1030s. And he and his wife, Queen Gisela, would spend Christmas at Goslar in 1031, 1034, and 1038, showing that the site had become important to the new Salian dynasty. And things really picked up under Henry III, who was the main builder of the Imperial Palace of Goslar. It was Henry III who commissioned the construction of the core of the Imperial Palace, and he would summon Benno II, one of the most famous architects of the time, to be involved in its architectural design. Some of Henry II's contributions include the Kaiserhaus, the Collegiate Church, and broader palace district, with the main building phase lasting from 1030 to 1056.
And the Kaiserhaus, or main palace building, is the central building of the entire complex and was the core imperial hall. It included a guard room on the lower floor and on the upper floor a throne room. The northern side of the building housed imperial apartments with a kitchen below. At 54 by 18 meters, it was the largest secular Romanesque hall in Germany of its time. And fun fact, its huge open hall had no windows. Yes, when you see movies and things like that, and they walk into the huge throne room, and there's all these windows and sunlight streaming in. Yes, not here.
Not here, no windows.
No windows. The Collegiate Church of St. Simon and St. Jude would be built from 1040 to 1050 and was one of the largest Romanesque churches east of the Rhine. It was consecrated in 1051, and only the north porch survives today. The Chapel of St. Ulrich was completed south of the Kaiserhaus and was one of the original palace chapels. It was commissioned by Queen Gisela after 1024 and built by Godhard of Hildesheim. It was connected to the royal apartments by a covered passage. There were also residence and functional buildings on the palace grounds, and that included working buildings, homes of the ministerialis, residences for the imperial entourage, and stables and storehouses. There was also a winter hall, which was heated, and the whole area was surrounded by a wall for fortification. So it really was a full imperial complex rather than just a palace. And if you look at pictures, it's kind of that rectangular structure.
So we've come now to the imperial throne of Goslar, and a survivor of an empire that no longer exists. This throne was cast in the second half of the 11th century. Its bronze backrest and armrest made of the gleaming metal of the Rammelsberg hill. The bronze seems to come alive with its patterns of pomegranates and palmetto leaves, and it sits atop a sandstone plinth that was carved in the 13th century. Its animals, such as a lion and legendary creatures as guardians, are made of stone. And for centuries, this throne stood in the great collegiate church in the heart of the Goslar Palace complex. And it was here that kings would witness coronations. And when the cathedral was demolished between 1819 and 1822, the throne was carried away and sold. But it would eventually return home to Goslar, which is quite nice if you imagine, like it got sold and then it came back. And in 1871, the German Empire rose and the first Berlin Reichstag prepared to open. Prince Charles of Prussia placed in its chamber, and Emperor William I took his seat on the throne. It was the last time that it would be used in an imperial ceremony. Prince Charles then sent the throne back to Goslar, where it now rests safely in the walls of the Imperial Palace. The stone plinth and replica of the throne stand on the surviving north porch. An empire may have come and gone, but the throne lives on. And aside from the Aachen throne of Charlemagne, it is the only remaining throne of a Holy Roman Emperor, which is so cool to know that this sits in Goslar.
Yes, it is very cool. And again, if you look up pictures of the throne, it is what you would expect. Everything that you would expect out of a throne of a Holy Roman Emperor. Very regal. And this brings us to the kings who shaped the Imperial Palace of Goslar. In the 11th century, the Salian Dynasty began to reshape the Holy Roman Empire. We're going to start with the very notable Henry III. According to some, the palace complex enjoyed its heyday under Henry III, and as we talked about, he completed major expansions to the complex and elevated it to what the medieval chronicler Lambert of Hersfeld would later call the most famous residence in the empire. Henry III's connection to Goslar wouldn't end with his reign, as one might think. It continued on in his death. Henry III left explicit instructions in his will for his heart and chest organs to be buried in Goslar, beside his daughter Mathilde, in the chancel of the Collegiate Church of St. Simon and St. Jude. It was his chosen Clarissimum Regis Domicilium, or the most splendid royal home, because Goslar was where his heart resided. And a side note, I did have to look into this a little bit because having his heart placed somewhere, it was a thing to separate the organs from the body as the ancient Egyptians did. Yes.
Okay.
And how do we know that his heart was buried here? So in the 19th century, workers opened the grave and found a hollow brick chamber that contained a decaying box with an amorphous organic substance. That was the physical remains of Henry III's heart. And could you just imagine opening a box? They then placed this in an octagonal vessel and moved it to the Imperial Palace, where it remains today. So his heart lives on in Goslar, as
Nice
he
to
wanted.
know. Yeah, as he wanted. His wishes are still followed.
Yes.
So we will follow up with Henry III's son. It's Henry IV. And if you're here for the drama, this is for you. Henry IV was born on November the 11th in 1050 in the Imperial Palace of Goslar, the same place that his father had elevated to a seat of Salian power. And from the start of his life, he would feel the weight of the crown that he had inherited. He would inherit the throne at the age of 6 at the death of its his father, and though his mother would hold power until Henry became of age. Through her actions, their power was weakened, notably when she turned over the Duchy of Bavaria to the Saxon Count Otto of Nordheim. The death of his father had also weakened their influence over Italy. When Henry was only 11 years old, everything would come to a head. In 1062, the Archbishop Anno II of Cologne seized the young king in the very dramatic coup of Kaiserwerth. While Henry and his mother were at the Königsfalls of Kaiserwerth, Henry was lured onto a ship in the nearby Rhine River. Fearing for his life, he fled overboard but was saved by Egbert, Count of Brunswick. Nice people in Brunswick. They took Henry. Struggle would follow, so they're not really nice. I'm sorry, just said something wrong. In 1063, Henry would witness a violent massacre inside a church in Goslar, which we'll get to a little later. In 1065, Henry would be declared to age, but things did not go smoothly for him. His childhood had been repeatedly interrupted by conflict, and it was said that he was characterized by recklessness and indiscretion. Henry was married in 1066, and this was not a happy marriage, as he attempted to divorce her 3 years later. This did not happen due to protests from the church. Henry would then face rebellion from the Saxons, and the rebellion grew so large, Henry was forced to escape to Worms. The greatest conflict would arrive during Christmas in 1075, when 3 envoys returned to Goslar carrying a letter from Pope Gregory VII. And the letter they carried condemned Henry's appointments of bishops in Italy and warned him that continued defiance would lead to excommunication. From this came a huge conflict, not just for Henry and Goslar, but one that would expand far beyond. It came to be known as the Investiture controversy. Within a year, Henry denounced Pope Gregory, and in return, Pope Gregory excommunicated Henry, and the German princes turned against their king. The conflict drove Henry to his famous penance at Canossa in 1077, where he reportedly walked and crawled over the Alps to Canossa. Henry then knelt in the snow at Canossa to receive papal forgiveness. According to rule, the Pope had to receive Henry where he showed him mercy, though they both knew this would not be the end. There would be a civil war, deposition attempts, and a second excommunication. The conflict would last from 1076 to 1122. And in 1081, Herman of Salm, the anti-king, who Henry IV was crowned and anointed in the Imperial Palace of Goslar. The investiture controversy would eventually come to an end with Pope Calixtus II and Henry V.
So this was the shortened version of what happened. It's kind of crazy. This is, I would watch a show about this. I would watch an HBO dramatized version of Henry IV and all of this conflict. We heard, his childhood, and we're also going to hear in just a little bit about the massacre that happened at this church that he witnessed. And then through his adult life, he and the Pope were in this massive disagreement. And before we move on, is the walk to Canossa or Gang nach Canossa, is that like a known phrase in Germany?
It is, okay. I did figure out, I heard it and I was like, I do know that saying.
Yeah, and so this is where it comes from.
Good to know.
Yes, the origins. Yes, we have Henry IV to thank for that phrase. And the drama will not end in Goslar. So another major figure that used the Imperial Palace of Goslar was Frederick Barbarossa. And if you listen to our episode of Burg Dankwarderode, then you probably remember his name. He's the one who started out as a major supporter of Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, even granting him the Duchy of Bavaria. The relationship would eventually fall apart, and Barbarossa exiled Henry the Lion The Imperial Palace of Goslar lay in the heart of Saxony, which was the region that Henry the Lion had dominated for decades and was a strategic position for Barbarossa. And if you're interested more about the conflict between the two, you can listen to our episode on Rhoda if you have not already. And you can actually see replicas of the famed Brunswick lion at the Imperial
So
Palace of
cool.
Goslar. Yeah. And moving on to Frederick II and the last major imperial moment in Goslar's political history. By the early 13th century, the Imperial Palace of Goslar was no longer central to the power of the Salian dynasty. Even so, in 1219, Emperor Frederick II chose Goslar for one of his most important political acts. Frederick II decided to hold an imperial diet in Goslar in 1219 to receive the imperial regalia. This would have been among the highest political assemblies of the empire, with princes, bishops, and imperial officials gathering all in one place. To give you the scope of the Imperial Palace of Goslar, this meant that it had to have the infrastructure to hold the event, from the residences to the space for the imperial entourages, the stables, the storehouses, and more. So,
Yeah.
big, big space.
And this brings us to the daily life at Goslar. From what we know about the scope of activities, including the large imperial gatherings for more than 200 years, the religious ceremonies that took place there, and the major political assemblies events would have been noisy with crowds and, as we've heard, sometimes political disputes. There would have been nobles in attendance, canons and clergy, mysterialists, and the imperial entourage. Not only that, but the staff, which would have been made up of scribes to record the charters and assemblies, guards, cooks, and servants and messengers.
And we've covered a lot in this episode, so we'll do a quick recap of all the major events and the drama, and we will get to the massacre that happened in the church. So here we go. The Imperial Palace of Goslar rose in the 11th century. It became a stage of the fiercest drama of the Holy Roman Empire. Its halls, chapels, courtyards witnessed births, political clashes, rebellions, coronations, and destruction across centuries, as we've heard about. And so if you remember, Henry II was the one who established the first palatial complex on the site. So he established the manor house that was originally there, and his successors would expand it. And by the mid-11th century, the palace had become a center for the empire. And in 1050, destiny would arrive in the form of Henry IV, the future emperor who was born at the palace. And his birth foreshadowed the storms that would enter into the empire. And here we have the Pentecost riot of 1063. Oh, we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about this riot, which was over seating arrangements. If you've listened to some of our other episodes, then you probably heard us talk about how everything was done with purpose, and seating and ceremonial occasions was no exception. This conflict was actually preceded in 1062 by a fight between the abbot of Fulda Abbey, Federad, and the bishop of Hildesheim, Hetzelo, and the same issue came up again in 1063, and they were prepared for armed conflict this time. And I'm actually just going to read what was written by Lambert of Hertzfeld because it is dramatic. So, what he says is, in the middle of the chancel and to the chanting of monks, an affray breaks out, except now they fight not just with clubs but with swords. A heated battle ensues, and battle cries and the wailing of dying echoes through the church instead of hymns and spiritual songs. On God's altars, victims are gruesomely slaughtered. Everywhere, rivers of blood run through the church, poured out not as formerly required by religious custom, but by hostile cruelty. The Bishop of Hildesheim found an elevated position and urged his men, as if using a military bugle call, to fight bravely, and so that they are not deterred from using weapons by the sanctity of the place, he holds up before them the standard of his authority and his permission. Many on both sides are wounded, many are killed, chief among them Bodo, Fulda's standard bearer, and Barrow, one of Count Egbert's most loyal vassals. During the affray, the king raises his voice loudly and implores the people to stop, appealing to his royal majesty. but he seems to preach to deaf ears. At the behest of his entourage to protect his own life and to leave the battlefield, he finally pushes his way with difficulty through the dense crowd of people and retreats to the palace. And that is the writing of Lambert of Hertzfeld. So, again, this is like the level of drama that I would expect to see like
Yes.
played out on screen.
We need a
Yeah.
movie about it.
We do. I need a movie about this because I mean, this is not what one would expect, and who knows how much license was taken when writing this, but the fact that that they stood up and said, "Yes, go ahead. This may be a church, but we approve. We approve of this
crazy.
violence."
Yeah.
It is just wild.
It's wild.
Wild. Okay, and moving on now. So from 1073 to 1075, we had the whole saga that we heard about Henry IV and the Pope who were at odds. And then the rival Herman of Salm was crowned in Goslar in 1081. And in 1132, we have the collapse and reconstruction of Goslar. So a hall of the palace collapsed, prompting a major rebuilding and reorganization of the complex. And this disaster would reshape the palace's architecture. And from 1152 to 1188, we had Frederick Barbarossa versus Henry the Lion, because they were at odds as well, even though they started out very close. And this played out in part within Goslar's precincts, reinforcing the palace's role as a place of imperial tension.
And as the Imperial Palace of Goslar was the seat for several Holy Roman emperors, we have to talk about the connections of religion and power. And from its earliest phase, the palace was designed to include a valid ensemble of churches as well as the royal buildings, with the Church of Our Lady to the north, the Ulrich Chapel immediately south of the Kaiserhaus, and the Collegiate Church of St. Simon and St. Jude to the east. The Collegiate Church of St. Simon and St. Jude was a monumental basilica with transept, crypt, westwork, and twin octagonal towers. And the surviving north porch even includes a sculpture that depicts Henry III among the apostles. The Palace Chapel of St. Ulrich, which is still preserved today, has a lower chapel in form of a Greek cross with 4 round apses. It has additional small apses on the north and south arm, and there's an upper chapel built as an octagon, which is connected by a pendentive vaulting. The design was well thought out, with the Greek cross and the octagon as forms that are associated with imperial and sacred architecture since the late antiquity, one example being Charlemagne's Palatine Chapel at Aachen. Interestingly, the upper chapel was reserved for the imperial, meaning that the emperor worshipped in a space that was elevated above the clergy and common people.
Mm-hmm. And also, when I was reading up on this one, apparently, like the shaping of it into the Greek cross was not common in Germany. So, though it was common in other areas, this was kind of a unique one for Germany of the time. And for more than 2 centuries, the Imperial Palace of Goslar was one of the more important places for the Holy Roman Empire. We've heard of emperors being born and crowned here, with it seeing the rise to the Salian Dynasty. It would lose its importance after the mid-13th century, with William of Holland being the last reigning king to stay in 1253. Then in 1289, a fire destroyed much of the palace district, including the Church of Our Lady, domestic quarters, and parts of the Kaiser House. The following year, the ownership of the palace district passed to the town of Goslar, and it was no longer imperial property. For a time, the hall would be used as a court divided between Goslar's sheriff and the Saxon district court. The decline would continue, and in the mid-1500s, part of the palace and older domestic buildings were converted into granaries. And the Palace of St. Ulrich turned into a prison in 1575. And this actually helped preserve it because they had to do upkeep and everything on it.
Yeah.
And in 1672, the two towers of the Church of Our Lady collapsed, with the remaining structure falling in 1722. And in 1819, the Collegiate Church of St. Simon and St. Jude was sold for demolition. And that's kind of crazy to think how it went from this major imperial residence and political center to granaries and a prison, and overall just collapsing. So it really, it was a true medieval, and it was
Kind of
in the late
sad.
night. It is kind of sad, yeah. And it was in the late 19th century that Goslar's town council decided against demolition, and restoration began in 1868. And on a visit by Emperor Wilhelm the First in 1875, he gave the restoration project a national blessing. And in 1879, reconstruction was completed. And that is the reason that you can still see the Imperial Palace today.
Thank you very much, Imperial
Yes.
Wilhelm.
Yes.
We come now to the reason we choose today to talk about the Imperial Palace of Goslar. That's because Walpurgisnacht, or Walpurgis Night, is on the April 30th. It's described on the website as when hell breaks loose in the Harz Mountains, with witches gathering across more than 20 towns in the region, and one of these towns is Goslar itself. Walpurgis Night is in the eve of the Christian feast day of Saint Walpurga, who was on 8th century abscess in France. And how is this related to a traditional pagan festival? Well, there was already the pre-Christian pagan festival for the changing of the seasons on May 1st, and the date of Walpurga's canonization was conveniently also on May 1st.
Mhm.
As for the night of Walpurgis, it was the belief that witches would gather on the April 30th to ride their brooms together at the Brocken in the Harz Mountains to dance and perhaps engage in human sacrifice and other plots. While the Holy Roman Emperor may have ruled in town, in the mountains there were rumors of witches' sabbaths and bonfires. Walpurgis Night and the witches flying to Brocken were made famous by Goethe's Faust, so let's read two small excerpts. The witches ride to the Brocken's top, the stubble's yellow and green the crop. There gathers the crowd for carnival, Sir Urien sits over all. And so they go over stone and stock. When round the summit whirls our flight, then lower and on the ground alight, and far and wide the heather press, with witch hoods swarms of wantonness. A nice bit of prose, but what is historically accurate is that from 1530 to 1657, 28 people were convicted of witchcraft in Goslar, and throughout the German witch trials, over 30,000 to 45,000 people were convicted of witchcraft all over Germany. And today you can see witch imagery around the town of Goslar and many of the towns in the Harz region. Yeah.
Yeah, so if
And
you
yeah.
remember when we, because I think it was actually Quedlinburg where we saw some witches first, and I was like,
Yes.
oh, like, what's this? Yes.
What is this? Yeah.
And then we went up into the Harz Mountains, and we went on that hike, and we came across that Alpine style coaster that
Yeah.
was witch themed. And then that's when you explained like Walpurgis Night, and that this was a thing, and that people hike up to the Brocken
In the
on
night, they
Walpurgis
do
Night.
like
Yeah.
night hikes and stuff, and it's getting really crazy. And tomorrow is going to be the big day, and we will see if we can find some pictures. But it is really crazy, and lots of towns in the Harz region do have like little witches everywhere. Like they have little signs of it, and they have like huge puppets hanging around, and it's quite interesting.
Yes. Yeah. I had
Yeah.
no idea what was. I was like, oh, there's all these like they're like little statues of witches and things like that.
Is it Halloween already?
Yes. Like, what's going on?
Yeah, and in Goslar you can get a bag of loose leaf hexenpunch or witch punch at the Elgar Walter tea shop near the market square, or walk on the witches' trails, which we just talked about. And there are lots of them, and they have witch names, so like little names for the trails. And the Witches Trail is a hiking trail that's around 94 kilometers, around 60 miles for our US listeners, and includes the old town of Goslar, as well as the mines of the Rummelsberg, and of course, the peak of the Brocken.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just maybe you don't have to do the 94 kilometers. If you want to
Yeah.
do it. But it's really nice to see all that stuff and see the little witches hanging around and the big history about it.
Yes. And because like you were saying, there are like trails that you can go on in the Hearts, and parts of them are connected to this 60-mile witches trail, which is pretty neat. And today's episode was filled with not just history, but also with lots of drama. So we've had the stealing of the imperial regalia, kidnapping, battles for the crown, and bloodshed. And we've talked about an imperial palace that fell to ruin and was eventually restored. But most importantly, can you have coffee and cake at this palace? Sadly, no, but there are cafes in Goslar with both coffee and cake, such as the Barak Cafe, Anders, and Schmidt's Cafe Garden. And I did look up pictures of these, what they serve there, and some of those cakes look really, really good.
So we have a place to go to have
Yeah,
some
so
coffee.
when we go to Goslar, we have some places to check out for our coffee and cake. Yeah.
Really nice, yeah.
Yes.
And it's so funny because like 3 years ago, we had our horses in Goslar, like 2 of them, and we
Okay.
always had to drive up to the Rummelsberg. It's so funny because I just
Ooh.
recognized the connection in my head, and I remember seeing lots of that stuff we talked about.
That is cool. Did you see the palace then? Did you drive past the
I
palace?
did, and I
Yeah.
always thought it looked so pretty, but I would have not, like, I hadn't had the connection in my head that it's a palace or that it's such a big history behind all that.
Yes,
So,
which is
guys, you
part of
have
the
to
reason why
visit
we
it.
do this.
Yes.
Yes, because we find out like all of this cool stuff. And like to your point, I feel like this is kind of like Donk Farderota, where when you see it, you
Yeah.
don't think, castle, palace. This one's a very Romanesque kind of structure, as we
Yeah.
talked about. And it's that big hall and, the walls and everything like that. Yeah.
I'm pretty
Which is
excited
pretty
to
cool.
go with you
Yes.
and visit it.
Me
So, guys,
too.
if you do it before us, leave us a comment, and thank you for listening today. And
Yes.
next
And
week,
yeah,
what are we going to listen to?
next week we will be talking about one that looks very much like a castle, Burg Eltz, and
Mm,
it has actually a couple people have requested ghost stories, and this castle comes with a well-known ghost story.
excited.
It'll
So,
be a good one.
thanks, and hear you next week.
Yes. Thank you guys.
Bye.
Bye.